Hello, friends. So, this video is something I've thought for quite a while, but I figured I'd just say it now because Americans don't know how to handle war right now. There were time periods in the past where Americans definitely knew and understood how to handle that, but that time is long past. And I'm not trying to say this in a sense of like, oh, okay, the youngins today are just pussies. Our grandparents wouldn't have known how to, or our grandparents would have known how to do this better. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Americans right now just don't know how to handle disasters. We don't know how to handle large numbers of people dying around us in arguably preventable fashion. During the COVID pandemic, which COVID's still around, by the way, people are still getting sick and people are still dying, but during the pandemic, over a million of us died. Like over a million. The exact number is higher, but it's over a million when you count not only deaths from the disease, but excess deaths. You know, people who couldn't get proper medical care because all the beds were full in the hospitals and things like that. A lot of people died as a direct result of that, and indirectly, even more died. And a lot of Americans responded to this by pretending nothing was wrong and pretending the virus was fake or just not a big deal. And actually, what we need to be doing right now is going back to work and making money for our bosses. Because the idea that a lot of people die sometimes and you can affect that in a small way, but not a very big way, a lot of Americans just cannot handle that. We just can't. And I think the best example of these mass deaths situations, or at least the best example of these mass death situations which are really easy for people to understand, is war. And I remember back when the attack at Benghazi happened, 4 Americans died there. Like, fucking 4. And that was a gigantic fucking deal. Like, there were congressional inquiries and people going, oh my gosh, let's blame this on Hillary Clinton, or let's blame this on Barack Obama. Let's blame this on our political opponents. And the fact that they were in a war zone and then war happened and some of them died, as happens in war, didn't really seem to occur to very many Americans. Like, can you imagine during World War II or even Vietnam if 4 Americans were killed in an attack and we had fucking congressional inquiries about it and people were talking about it on the news for literal years afterwards and they made movies and wrote books about it? And one of the guys who was at the Benghazi attack tried running for mayor of Colorado Springs a little while ago. He didn't get very far with it, thankfully, but he tried. But that just wouldn't have happened back then because so many thousands of other people were already dying or getting wounded or just having, horrible things happen to them, which is what happens in war. And you could argue, like, well, okay, it only blew up into a big deal because right-wing media was trying to hype it up and right-wing politicians were trying to, politicize or capitalize on it and turn it into a big political show. And you're right, but the only reason that worked is because there were a lot of Americans, or the majority of Americans, I would say, who actually cared and were like, oh my gosh, 4 dead people, that's such a tragedy. Which, I mean, again, even if you look at that, a lot more Libyans died than Americans, but whatever. The point is, we just don't know how to deal with people dying in wars. Like, in the war in Afghanistan, only about 2,400 Americans died. And don't get me wrong, that's awful, that's a tragedy, and a lot more got wounded or otherwise hurt as well. And I've known people who were in Afghanistan and who were in Iraq, and like, I'm not saying that that was easy or fun for them by any means. I'm just saying not that many people died, really. It wasn't that big a deal. And then in Iraq, more people died, but it was still only about 4,500 Americans. If you want to include all of our allies who were killed there as well, then the number is higher. But it's still tiny when you compare it to larger conflicts like Vietnam, Korea, World War II, and obviously other countries. I know a lot of people watch these who are not American, but you can probably look back at your own country's history and say, like, yeah, we've had single days in a battle where more of our soldiers died than Americans died in the entirety of Iraq and Afghanistan combined. But I am still old enough to remember that whenever a soldier died in Iraq, it was on the news. Or pretty much any time a soldier died in Iraq, if they were from this area. Like, they didn't have to be from a small town and the local news did a thing about it because everyone in that small town knew him. It would just be, this guy was from Kansas, so everyone in Kansas would hear about it or see it on the news. Or this guy was from Colorado. Everyone in Colorado heard about it and saw it on the news, which I live in Colorado. I saw this happen multiple times. Like, it would be a soldier from the other side of the state. This state has like 5 million people living in it. We're not a small town. I wouldn't know that guy or have any connection with him, but I would still hear about it on the news because Americans just don't know how to handle it, and we're trying to hype it up and make it so that every single one that dies is an immense loss and tragedy, but also the war needs to continue, which was always the subtext when talking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan during the 2000s. The tone didn't really shift until a couple of years later. And I'm seeing this, and I'm looking over at the war in Ukraine right now and seeing how obviously the exact casualty numbers are kind of obscured by both sides there, but it's at least a couple 100,000 dead at this point, soldiers and civilians, and the war is continuing. And I just keep thinking, like, man, if America was getting invaded and like 50, 60, 100,000 of our own soldiers had been killed, we wouldn't know what to do with it. I'm not saying we would immediately surrender and give up or something, but we just would not know how to handle it. And that kind of worries me, because if a bigger war breaks out, like let's say with China, right? Because I've seen people speculate that China is currently planning on invading Taiwan in late 2027 or early 2028, which, again, I don't know enough to really comment on that. I'm just saying I've heard people speculate that that's what's going to happen, and if America allows the Russians to win in Ukraine, then maybe that makes us look weak, and it makes us look like we'll abandon our allies, so China will see an opportunity. Like, that's what I've heard people say. I don't know enough. I'm just not an expert on that. But anyways, the point is, if that war starts and it happens and it's really bad and like thousands and thousands of soldiers and sailors are over there actively fighting a near-peer adversary, like, it's not going to be a counterinsurgency. We're going to be fighting an actual modern military, which, even if it's not quite on par with the American military, can still deal some serious damage. How are we going to react to that? You know, if half the country lost its fucking mind when 4 dudes were killed at Benghazi, how are we going to react when an aircraft carrier is shot down and 2,000 crewmen sink and die with that? Like, how are we going to react to that? If we just sort of shrugged and moved on and gave up when COVID happened and pretended nothing was going on, you can't really do that with a massive war. And for the life of me, I just don't know how we're going to react to this. Like, a lot of Americans will just be driven fucking insane if and when that happens. I think a lot of Americans just don't know how to understand that we aren't the gods of the world. Like, we aren't above everything else and immune from all the other problems that are going on. But at the same time, a lot of us really want to feel like victims. I assume it's a Christian martyr complex thing. But like, I don't know how Americans are going to react or respond or deal with this, because when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were happening, especially in the last couple of years, we just didn't think about them that much. But even when they were at the forefront of everyone's minds, we were trying to act like we were the victims. Like, yes, we're terrified because Saddam Hussein himself is going to come and blow up my Ford Focus specifically. Like, they're just so terrified of terrorism, which is kind of the fucking point of terrorism. That's where the word comes from, terror. But they were just so fucking afraid of it that they were perfectly willing to send off people to die, but mostly to fight and kill other people on the other side of the world who they didn't know and they didn't like to think about. They just pretended everything was fine. But after a certain point, the war will come back. If it's a bigger war rather than just a counterinsurgency operation, if it's like a full-on war, like if it is, again, a big war against China, like I mentioned, we are pretty much all going to know someone who died, And I don't know if there's going to be massive conspiracy theories about how there's not actually a war happening, which is a thing in about the Ukraine war, by the way. A lot of right-wing people are just kind of pretending that the war is fake and it's being staged because they're fucking retarded. But that's going to be a thing. There's going to be things about how, oh, they're blowing up the casualty numbers to make it seem bigger for whatever reason. People are going to blame the Jews for it because they're always blaming the Jews for stuff. And I think that's ultimately a symptom of Americans just not knowing how to deal with death and not understanding that shit just fucking happens sometimes. And you don't have complete control over it, but you can at least try to have some control over it. You know, again, wear a mask, get vaccinated, and some people, I don't know, man. Americans don't know how to deal with death. And sooner or later, that's going to drive us all insane.